Hey everyone, my name is Angel Quintero. I'd like to thank Coach McKeefery and the rest of the strength and conditioning staff at Fresno State for this year's summer internship and for putting this intern clinic together for us. So prior to this internship, I was part of the strength and conditioning staff at Cal State East Bay. During my time at East Bay, I was also a part of a research team investigating training loads in Division III athletes, specifically in their sessions with their sport coaches. Throughout this research, I've had the question in the back of my head of how can we as strength and conditioning coaches implement this into our program. So I'll be presenting on the use of RPE to monitor training loads with our athletes. So in this image of Milo of Croton, the Italian wrestler in the 6th century BC, we see him carrying this bull. We often use images of Milo of Croton to display progressive overload, but I want to look at this in a more acute manner. So us as a coach, how can we measure Milo's training load? So a few things that come to mind are the distance he travels carrying the bull's mass, the time he carries the bull, or as simple as asking Milo, how was your session? Now, how was your session is one way that we can use RPE with our athletes in our training load monitoring. Before we go into RPE and how we can use it, we're going to go through a brief history of training load monitoring. So in the early 1900s, we started to see athletes carrying their stopwatches during training. Paavo Nurmi, who we see in this image, or the flying Finn, ran on the track using a stopwatch. Whether he used it to monitor his race pace or to just monitor his training load over time, we don't know, but he was carrying the stopwatch in the early 1900s. Soon after that, we saw Gostel Halmer, who invented fartlek training and who would include sections of his run that were at race pace during his training. Gunder Haag, a Swedish runner, we started to see adjusting his training based on perception. So he would decrease his higher volume running because he felt that it wasn't working in his benefit and was feeling ill during this higher volume training. So he just decided to increase the intensity for his training and decreasing that volume overall. 1930s, we saw Dr. Reindl and Coach Gerschler out in Germany using heart rate to monitor their athletes' sessions. Now they would adjust these sessions if necessary. So they would set a heart rate BPM of 180 for their higher interval work, and then 120 beats per minute for their rest intervals. Now, if they saw that heart rate wasn't coming down to 120 during their rest, then they would adjust that session. So they would either decrease the pace or decrease the distance traveled, or they would even call the session off and call it a day for the athlete. This time, or these methods popularized interval training because of the simplicity to track the athlete's progress. In the 1950s, we started to see more interval training being utilized by coaches. We have Franz Stampfel working with Roger Bannister, who broke the 4-minute mile barrier, utilizing interval training. So they would start their training with a 10 by 400 meters with a pace of 70 seconds per lap. Now they had the goal pace of 60 seconds per lap for that 10 by 400 as well. The interesting thing with this training is if Coach Stampfel saw his athletes to feel stale, or what we call non-functional overreaching, he would send his athletes on a hiking holiday, and this would kind of serve for them as a active rest and recovery. Once they returned from this hiking holiday, they would progress with their training. Around the same time, Bill Bowerman out at the University of Oregon was also utilizing interval training similar to Coach Stampfel. In inclusion to the interval training, he also had easy days, hard days, and jogging for his sessions. Now Foster, Rodriguez, Marroyo, and DeConning in this 2017 paper called this period as the zenith of external training load, where we started to see the popularity of the training load monitoring grow a little more. In the 1980s, we started to see more portable blood lactate analyzers, heart rate monitors, and respiratory gas analyzers. So we started to see more methods of monitoring these internal training loads within the athletes. Present day, some things that we see in our weight rooms and in our conditioning work, we got velocity-based training, where we create these load velocity profiles for our athletes. We use the transducer that we see hooked up to the barbell here to measure the barbell's velocity. And one pro of this is that it gives us instant feedback for the coaches and the athletes on that lift for the day. Some other examples of wearable technology are GPS, which can measure accelerations, decelerations, velocity, distance traveled, and changes of directions for our athletes. We also see heart rate straps being utilized for heart rate methods of monitoring training load. Now, although these are useful for coaches and they're very popular in our field, they're not always realistic for our coaches to have or use within our programs, especially if our budget isn't the highest. We can't afford this, or if we don't have the staff available to track and analyze the data that we collect from these methods. So let's keep in mind when we're looking at training loads that we have external and internal training loads. External training loads are important for the organization and planning of our training. So some examples are velocity, volume, distance, time, or percent 1RM. Then we have the internal training loads, which is the physiological response of the athlete. And this is caused by the external training load put on them, in addition to any other stressors that they have going on, or their recovery between sessions. So some methods of measuring internal heart rate or internal training load are heart rate, lactate concentrations, hormonal assessments, and rate of perceived exertion, or RPE. So the combination of both internal and external training loads can help us create a successful program with our student athletes. We have an understanding, or somewhat of an understanding, of our programming to create acute stressors or fatigue on our athletes, which in return produce these chronic adaptations or the fitness of our athletes. Now, when using different methods to monitor training load, we got to keep the coach-athlete interface in mind. So we do this by providing athletes with knowledgeable, informed coaches, and coaches need ways to evaluate their athlete's current status and how an athlete is responding to the program. So again, we have this fitness fatigue relationship that we're looking at. Now, coaches, we do need a realistic method for our program that we can utilize with our methods, and also making sure that these methods are valid and reliable. So a quick look at RPE and what it is. So rate of perceived exertion is on a 0 to 10 scale on these methods that we're using. Carl Foster proposed the session RPE method to calculate internal training load. This was originally used with endurance athletes, but it has been shown to be a valid measurement for team sport athletes as well. So in this example here, we ask an athlete, how was your session? And an athlete will respond on the 0 to 10 scale, 0 being rest, 10 being maximal effort. And again, we'll go over different methods of using RPE to monitor our training loads with our athletes. So whenever we have some sort of method or technology to monitor training loads, we got to make sure that they are valid and that they are reliable. So validity, does it measure what it is intended to measure? And reliability, are the findings consistent across time and across researchers or coaches? So in this study here by Alexiou and Coots, we are comparing the session RPE method to heart rate-based methods to monitor training load. So let's take a look at the session RPE method. It is the session RPE on that 0 to 10 scale, and we multiply that by the duration of the session in minutes, and we end up with this training load in arbitrary units. So in this study, they compared the SRPE method to heart rate methods, which include Bannister's TRIMP, which is using the athlete's average resting heart rate and the average exercise heart rate to calculate training load. Lactate threshold zone training load utilizes heart rate zones based on the athlete's lab results prior to these sessions, and then they take the amount of time spent in the zones, in different zones based on lactate threshold to calculate this training load. Edwards training load uses the time spent in standardized predetermined heart rate zones for each athlete. So once we're looking at the table 2 here on the left, we see the methods on top: Bannister, Shrimp, LT zone, and Edwards. And then on the left, we see the types of sessions that were run throughout the study. So we have conditioning, matches, speed, technical, and resistance training. Now these R values, this is pretty much the relationship or the correlation between the heart rate-based method and the SRPE method. So we're looking for a perfect value of 1.00. That means that they match up perfectly. So it's between -1 and 1. 0 means no relationship between the methods. So if we look at these sessions that are circled in blue, we have conditioning, speed, and technical work. These had the strongest relationships between SRPE and the heart rate methods. Matches still had a positive relationship, but not as strong. Then we see the resistance training with the weakest relationship. So what we can take away from this is that if we're doing conditioning work with our athletes, we can utilize the SRPE method to monitor their training load. Resistance training, based on this study, it's not a valid measurement of monitoring their training load in the weight room. We are strength and conditioning coaches, so how can we utilize this in the weight room outside of their conditioning work? So RPE validity and reliability in the weight room. So in this study, they're utilizing the SRPE method again, and they're looking at different intensities and rep schemes for these participants. So for their exercises, they had back squat, bench press, overhead press, triceps curl, and triceps push down. Now, if we look at the green circle, that's the higher intensity group, so 90%, 4 to 5 reps. Medium intensity, 10 reps at 70%. Low intensity, 15 reps at 50%. Now, if we look at figure 1 on the bottom and we look at 90%, we see that the 90% sessions had higher RPE values compared to 70 and 50%. Now, the 50% group at 15 reps, they did perform more total work in these sessions compared to the 70% and 90%. But even though they did complete more work, their RPE values are lower. So we got to keep that in mind when we're looking at RPE values. If we're wanting athletes to hit 90% of their 1RM, we kind of have an estimate here of the RPE of that lift for certain exercises. So again, we have the back squat, bench press, overhead press, curls, and tricep push downs. Another takeaway from the session is that SRPE method was found reliable across the same intensities on different days. Each participant went through all of these different intensities for each session, individual sessions for each intensity twice. And they found the findings between those 2 sessions for each intensity consistent over time. So this gives us a little bit of information of how we can utilize it within the weight room. If we're at 50% 1RM and we are hitting higher reps, we should expect the athletes to be hitting these lower RPEs, even though they are completing more work compared to the higher intensities. Some of the reasons for this may be the higher muscular and neural contributions at those higher intensities. Another study looking at the validity of RPE in the weight room. This one is interesting because it compared RPE to velocity. So they're looking at velocity-based training and comparing it to the athlete's RPE for these lifts. They used the bench press in the study. Keep in mind for this study, they are utilizing the reps and reserve method. So if we look at the figure 3 on the right, if we look at the rating of 9 out of 10, that means that the athlete has 1 rep remaining for that lift. So if they were to hit that lift and get 5 reps and give it a rating of 9, that means they could have hit 6 reps on that set if they wanted to. So that kind of gives us an idea of how they're feeling for that lift, specifically to how many reps are remaining, or what some of us call reps in the tank. So what this can do for us is give us a way to auto-regulate within the session if If we want an athlete to hit an RPE of 9.5, that means that they can't complete any further reps, but they should be able to increase that load for that exercise. So now that we know that RPE methods can be reliable and valid in conditioning work and in the weight room, let's look at some ways to integrate it into our programs. Now, a quick reminder, anytime we're doing session RPE, we're asking the athletes, ideally 30 minutes after their session, how was your session? And they'll answer on the 0 to 10 scale. For the reps and reserve method, we can either ask them the RPE of that lift. So remember, 9 would be 1 rep remaining, or we can just ask them how many reps in the tank, or what's your RIR for that lift. That's totally up to you. If you want to avoid any confusion, you can just refer to this as RIR, and any other time you're using RPE, just ask them for their RPE value. So here we have some examples of how we can auto-regulate within our sessions. So if we look at Monday, exercise A2, we got the back squat, 6x3. Based on our percent 1RM, they would be working at a load of 315. Now we have that load there, but if they hit that load of 315 and it feels like they have 4 reps in reserve, then we can adjust that and have them increase the weight until they hit that 2 reps in reserve feeling, or a RPE of 8 on the reps in reserve method. So that is one way that we can auto-regulate within our sessions in the weight room. Now, if we look at Tuesday, we have our conditioning day. We got some tempo runs for A1, 2x4x200. Our goal intensity is RPE 6 to 7, so somewhere between 6 and 7. So let's say the athletes run their first rep. Athlete A hits an RPE of 8. Athlete B hits an RPE of 5. So athlete A, we can either have them increase their rest in between their tempo runs, maybe adjust these shoulder taps and decrease the volume on those, or we can just have them decrease their pace on those tempo runs. Again, that's totally up to the coach on how you want to adjust your sessions. On the other side, we have athlete B, RPE 5. Again, he's below that goal intensity of 6 to 7. So we'll just have him increase his pace for the rest of this session, trying to hit that 6 to 7 RPE. Now we're looking at daily and weekly training loads based on the session RPE method. So we have 4 weeks here, sessions on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The total amount of work done at the end of the week. So again, we just combine the training load from Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, get a total. And then we have changes in training load from week to week. So we're a coach and we see this change in training load on week 3 with an increase of 31%. Then we can look at the sessions and see what's causing this. So one way that we can look at it is to go back to the previous Friday, which was a training load of 500. Now for all the other days, if you look at Monday and Wednesday, we see increases week to week from week 1 to 3. So for Monday, we have a training load of 500, week 1, week 2, 550, week 3, 600. Again, on Wednesday, we see these increases week to week. But Friday, we see an increase, or we have 700 on week 1. We have a decrease on week 2. And then we have this big increase week 3. So as coaches, we can look at this and say, hey, talk to the athlete, ask them what's happening between Wednesday and Friday that may be causing this big spike for that training load on Friday. Or we can go to the previous week and ask them if they completed the work that was asked of them on that Friday where they reported a training load of 500. We can also ask them if they want to look at that data and if that was the correct data that they meant to input on their RPE. So as far as tracking the data goes, it is fairly simple. Ideally, you want to get this data from them 30 minutes after the athlete's session. So 30 minutes after the session, they'll answer the question on that 0 to 10 scale. How was your session? And then we'll multiply that times the duration of the session to get their training load. A few ways that we can do this is using a Google form, or we can use their workout card. If you're using workout cards in your program, maybe just add a cell for that RPE on there at the end of their session. or if your training software that you're utilizing to program for your athletes has an option for RPE, you can do that on there as well. Now, some of the drawbacks of using RPE are comparisons between athletes. So if they're filling this RPE out together, there might be the risk of them comparing themselves and trying to one-up each other on their RPE to seem like the stronger or more fit athlete. So we want to make sure that we stress the importance of them basing this just on their perception and having no comparisons between athletes. Also, sometimes the data can get a little funky. An example of using Google Forms, sometimes they can input 2 different data points for one day, even though they had one session on accident. Or they can just input the wrong RPE and duration of the session on accident. So keeping an eye on that. And also, if you have too many athletes for one staff member, trying to track and analyze all this data may make it a little overwhelming. So the amount of staff may make a difference in using RPE to monitor your training loads. Now, some of the benefits, we have the auto regulation, again, adjusting the session based on the RPE that they give us. So if it's feeling too easy for them, we can bump up that intensity or vice versa. It is simple and cost effective. Again, if they're already using their phones or filling things out on tablets, then they can just input their RPE on that tablet. Also, it does create dialogue between the coach and athlete. If we start seeing fluctuations in their training loads where we weren't expecting them, and this can create that dialogue between the coach and the athlete and ask what's going on outside of the sport, what's going on outside of school, and create these conversations so we can adjust their training if necessary. Also, another example of how we can use this is during this spring and summer that just passed for the COVID home workouts, giving them a goal intensity using RPE for their sessions. So instead of saying, hey, use whatever weight you have at home and hit 20 reps, depending on the goal of that block, we can say, hey, use the weight you have at home and try to hit this RPE within this rep scheme. So it kind of gives us a more objective way of programming for them when we're not having all this contact with the athletes and they don't have all the resources necessary for us to lay out this program for them. So that is my presentation on RPE to monitor training loads. Here are my references. Thanks again to Coach McKeefery for putting together this intern clinic for us. If you have any questions or want to chat more about using RPE to monitor training loads, feel free to send me an email or send me a DM on Instagram. Thanks again for your time.